My name is Whitney. I'm 26, and at the time all of this started, my life looked stable from the outside in a way that made people stop asking questions. I worked night shifts as an ER nurse at St. Mary's Community Hospital, the kind of job that sounds impressive until you realize it mostly means running on caffeine, adrenaline, and about 4 hours of sleep on a good day. I'd clock in when most people were settling down for dinner, and I'd walk out when the sun was coming up and the world felt like it belonged to someone else. It was hard, but it was honest work, and I was good at it. I liked knowing that when things got chaotic, I didn't freeze. I moved, I acted, I helped. That mattered to me more than comfort ever did. 3 years earlier, right after finishing nursing school, I made what I thought was a smart decision. Instead of signing a lease somewhere and throwing money at a landlord I didn't know, I moved back into my parents' house. It wasn't because I couldn't afford to live on my own. I could have. But my father sat me down one Sunday after. "Why pay strangers rent when you can help your own family?" he said, like he was offering me a shortcut to being both responsible and loyal at the same time. It sounded reasonable. Actually, it sounded more than reasonable. It sounded like the kind of choice a good daughter would make. We agreed on $1,200 a month. No lease, no paperwork, just a handshake and a monthly transfer. I remember typing rent into the memo line the first time and feeling oddly proud of it, like I was doing the adult thing, while still staying connected to where I came from. That number was higher than what a one-bedroom apartment would have cost in our area, but I told myself that didn't matter. This wasn't just rent. This was support. This was family. And once I accepted that idea, everything else fell into place in a way that felt natural at the time. My routine became predictable. I'd finish a 1-2 hour shift drive home while the radio hosts were still half asleep and walk into a house that was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and whatever show my father had left, paused on the TV. Before I even thought about sleep, I'd make breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee, set out like a small system that ran because I made it run. It wasn't something anyone asked me to do directly, but it became expected quickly enough that stopping would have felt like making a statement. And I wasn't trying to make statements back then. I was trying to keep things smooth. Wednesdays were for laundry. Saturdays were for cleaning bathrooms, vacuuming, taking out trash that somehow no one else ever noticed. It added up, but I didn't keep score. At least not at first. My younger sister Megan lived in the room across the hall, and her version of life looked very different. She was 2 years younger, still figuring things out according to my father, which seemed to mean she didn't have to pay rent, didn't have to follow a routine, and didn't have to explain much of anything. She had time for brunches, photos, and long phone calls that somehow counted as being busy. I had shifts, responsibilities, and a monthly transfer labeled rent that left my account like clockwork. I noticed the difference, of course I did, but I explained it away in the same way I explained everything else. She's younger. She'll get there. This is temporary. My father will see the effort eventually. That last part mattered more than I wanted to admit. I wasn't just paying to live there. I was investing in the idea that consistency and reliability would be recognized, that if I showed up, did the work, and didn't complain, it would balance out over time. My father wasn't openly harsh or anything like that. He just operated on a system where appreciation wasn't something he expressed, and I convinced myself that meant I needed to earn it, not expect it. Looking back, that belief did a lot of heavy lifting for him. Every month, I sent the same $1,200. Every month, I typed the same word, rent. It became automatic, like brushing my teeth or setting an alarm. And every time I hit send, I reinforced the story I was telling myself, that this was the right thing to do, that helping family meant giving without questioning where the line was. It didn't feel like a sacrifice. Not yet. It felt like structure, like purpose, like I was building something stable in a world that didn't always offer that. If you had asked me back then whether I felt taken advantage of, I would have said no without hesitation. I would have told you I was lucky. I had a job that paid well, a place to live, and a family I could support. That was the narrative I stuck to. Even when small things didn't quite line up, like the way requests came to me as expectations, or how my time seemed more flexible than anyone else's by default, I didn't push back. I adjusted. That was my pattern. Keep things running, keep things calm, and trust that it would come back around in some form. I didn't think of it as giving something up. I thought of it as doing what was right, and as long as I believed that everything else made sense, or at least it seemed like it did, I set my bag down by the door, still in scrubs that smelled like antiseptic, and headed straight for the kitchen because that's what I always did, not because anyone asked me to, but because if I didn't, the day would start with small things already out of place. And I had trained myself to fix small things before they turned into bigger ones. So I cracked eggs into a pan, started coffee, and moved around quietly while the rest of the house stayed comfortably unaware that the morning was already being handled for them. And that contrast started to stand out more the longer I paid attention to it, because my mornings had a structure that no one else seemed to share, especially not Megan, who usually woke up around the time I was finally getting ready to sleep, scrolling through her phone in bed, laughing at something on social media, asking if there was any coffee left, like it had just appeared on its own, and I would say yes, even if I had just poured the last cup, because it was easier than explaining the effort behind it. And that became the pattern, not just once, not just occasionally, but every single day, a quiet system where I showed up early, did the work, and left things better than I found them while she stepped into the result, without ever thinking about how it got there. And I noticed it in the small details first, like how my father would comment on Megan's outfit before she went out, but never on the breakfast sitting in front of him, or how he'd ask her about her plans for the day with interest, but barely looked up when I mentioned a long shift ahead, like one required attention, and the other was just expected background noise. And I told myself it didn't bother me that we were just different, that our roles in the house weren't meant to look the same. But that explanation started to feel thin when the same pattern showed up in bigger ways, like money where I was transferring $1.200 every month without fail, labeled clearly as rent, while Megan contributed nothing, and no one treated that as unusual. It was just understood that she was still figuring things out, a phrase that covered everything without actually explaining anything, and I tested that once carefully, the kind of careful that comes from already knowing you might not like the answer, asking my father why she wasn't paying anything, and he didn't even turn his head, just said she needed time, and told me not to be petty, like question itself was the problem, not the situation. And that moment stuck with me longer than I expected, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so casual, like fairness wasn't something we were even pretending to aim for. And after that, I stopped asking questions out loud, but I didn't stop noticing, and the more I noticed, the harder it was to ignore the pattern repeating itself in different forms, like when Megan got engaged, and suddenly the entire house shifted around to her. My father repainting the living room over a single weekend, carefully taping edges, choosing colors she liked, putting in effort I hadn't seen him put into anything for me in years. And I remembered asking him to fix a water stain on my ceiling that had been there long enough to feel permanent, and he had said he'd get to it, which translated into never, and I didn't bring it up again, but I watched him repaint for her without being asked twice, and that comparison didn't need to be said out loud to feel real. And even the way Megan spoke to me reflected that same dynamic, not rude exactly, just comfortable in a way that assumed I would say yes. Like when she asked me to prepare food for her engagement party, not as a favor but as something I was naturally responsible for, and I agreed, because saying no would have created a moment I wasn't used to creating, and I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that helping was just part of who I was, but the truth was, it was becoming part of who everyone expected me to be, and there's a difference between choosing to help and being positioned as the person who always will. And that difference showed up in how things were framed, where Megan's needs were treated like priorities and mine were treated like details that could wait, and I adapted to that without realizing how much I was adjusting, shifting my own expectations lower so the situation could still feel balanced in my head, because if I admitted it wasn't balanced, then I'd have to decide what to do about it, and I wasn't ready for that yet, so I focused on what I could control: my schedule, my work, my routine, telling myself that consistency mattered more than recognition, that doing the right thing didn't need an audience, and that belief kept everything running, but it also kept me in place, because every time I chose not to question something, the pattern got a little stronger, and every time I filled in the gap, whether it was cooking, cleaning, or covering a responsibility no one else picked up, it reinforced the idea that I would keep doing it. and the house functioned smoothly because of that. But it functioned in a way where my role was fixed and everyone else's was flexible, and I didn't explode over it. I didn't confront anyone or make a scene. I just carried the awareness quietly, like a background noise that got a little louder each day. Not enough to stop everything, but enough that I couldn't pretend I didn't hear it anymore, and even then I kept going. Because stopping would have meant admitting that the system I believed in wasn't working the way I thought it was, and I wasn't ready to say that out loud yet. I turned onto my street just after sunrise, hands still a little stiff from a 12-hour shift, and the first thing that felt off wasn't anything dramatic. It was just how quiet everything looked, like nothing had moved while I was gone. And then I noticed the boxes on the lawn, 3 of them, unevenly taped, sitting where the grass dipped slightly near the walkway, and for a second my brain tried to make it normal, like maybe someone had a delivery or was clearing out the garage. But then I saw my laundry basket tipped over on its side, half my clothes spilling into the wet grass, and that's when the part of me that always fixes things just stopped, because there was nothing to fix, yet just something to understand. So I parked, didn't even turn off the engine at first, just stared through the windshield at what I was looking at, trying to line it up with anything that made sense, and when it didn't, I opened the door and stepped out. The air cold enough to cut through my scrubs, shoes damp almost immediately as I walked across the lawn, and I recognized things one by one, not all at once, like my brain was pacing itself, my winter coat folded badly into a box that was already soft from moisture, my nursing textbook stacked too, neatly to be an accident. The small wooden box I kept on my dresser, sitting near the edge of the walkway where the concrete met the grass. And I remember thinking that whoever did this had taken time, not rushed, not panicked, just moved everything with intention, and that thought didn't land fully until I reached the front door and saw the lock bright, clean new in a way that didn't belong to the rest of the house, and I pulled my key out automatically like routine, could still solve this, and slid it in, and it didn't turn, not even a little, and I tried again slower, like maybe I just didn't have it lined up right, and it still didn't move. And that's when my phone buzzed in my hand. 1. Message my father's name on the screen, and I opened it, standing there on the porch, my bag still hanging off my shoulder, and it said, "Your room is Megan's now. Come get your stuff from the lawn." Don't make a scene, and I read it once then again, because the words were simple enough, but they didn't connect to the situation in a way that felt real, and I looked back at the lawn like maybe I had misunderstood what I was seeing, like those boxes could still belong to someone else. If I just gave it another second, but they didn't change, nothing, shifted, nothing corrected itself. And another message came in this time from my mom, "Honey, your father already decided." It's better this way, and I remember focusing on that word better, like it had a clear definition that I was supposed to recognize, and I sat down on the porch step without deciding to, just lowered myself, like my legs had finished their part and were done the concrete cold, even through the fabric of my scrubs, and for a few minutes I didn't move, I didn't cry, I didn't call anyone, I just sat there looking to the front door that I had walked through every day for 3 years, the same door I had locked behind me that morning before going to work, and now it wasn't mine to open anymore, and I started replaying small details, not memories exactly, just facts. Like how I had paid on the first of every month, how I had never missed a transfer, how I had typed the same word each time, rent, and how that word suddenly felt like it belonged to a different situation than the one I was in now, and I stood up again after a while, not because I had a plan, but because sitting there wasn't changing anything, and I walked over to the boxes and crouched down, pressing my hand lightly against one to feel how damp it was, the cardboard already starting to give, and I opened the top flap carefully, like there was still something fragile inside that could be protected, and saw my clothes folded in a way I didn't recognize. Not messy, just not mine. And that bothered me more than I expected because it meant someone else had gone through everything I owned and decided how it should be packed. And I picked up the wooden box next, wiping a bit of moisture off the surface with my sleeve, checking inside without really needing to, just confirming that it was all still there, like proof that this was actually happening. And my phone rang, my father calling this time, and I watched it ring until it stopped, then listened to the voicemail without moving from where I was. His voice flat, controlled, telling me not to be dramatic, telling me to pick up my things before the neighbors started asking questions. Like the problem here was visibility, not what had been done. And I looked up then across the street, noticing for the first time that Mrs. Patterson was outside, watering her plants, not staring exactly, but not looking away either. And I realized this wasn't private. This wasn't something that had been handled quietly or carefully. This was a decision that had been made and carried out in full view of anyone who happened to be watching, and that detail settled in differently than everything else, because it meant this wasn't just about space or timing. It was about control, about sending a message in a way that couldn't be misunderstood. And I stood there for another minute, keys still in my hand even though they didn't work anymore. And for the first time since I had pulled into the driveway, I stopped trying to explain it, stopped trying to fit it into something reasonable, and just accepted what was right in front of me, that the place I had been paying to live in was no longer available to me, that the arrangement I thought I had was gone, without notice, and that whatever came next wasn't going to be solved by going back inside and talking it out, because there was no inside anymore, just a door I couldn't open, and a lawn full of my things telling me exactly where I stood. I sat in my car with the door closed and the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel longer than they needed to be, not because I didn't know what to do next, but because I needed a minute where nothing else changed, and then I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app without thinking too hard about it, just following the one thing I could still control, and I scrolled back through the transactions slowly, not rushing, letting each one load. Each line confirming what I already knew, but hadn't fully added up yet. $1,200, same amount, same note rent over and over again, month after month. And I started doing the math in my head, first rough numbers. 3 years, 12 months each. That's 36 payments. And then I switched to the calculator because I wanted to see it exactly, not approximately. And when the number came up, $43,200, I just stared at it for a second, not shocked in the dramatic sense, just steady, like when you finally see something clearly after ignoring it for a long time, and I leaned back in the seat, phone still in my hand, and looked out at the lawn, again at the boxes that had already started to sag from the tapped-in moisture, and that number didn't feel abstract anymore. It felt tied directly to what I was looking at. To the fact that everything I owned was sitting outside because someone decided I didn't need notice, didn't need a conversation, didn't need anything beyond a text message, and I checked my account balance next, not because I expected it to be high, but because I needed to know exactly where I stood, and it was just over $2,000, which sounds like something until you start thinking about deposits, first month, last month, basic furniture, moving costs, things that add up fast when you don't have a place to go. And I did that math too, not out loud, just running through it in my head. And the gap between what I had and what I needed was obvious, not impossible, but not easy either. And that's when the situation shifted for me, from something emotional to something practical, because feeling upset wasn't going to solve any of that. And I had spent 3 years operating under the assumption that what I was doing made sense financially, that paying my father instead of a landlord was at least neutral, if not better, and now I was sitting there realizing that I had paid more than market rent for a room I didn't legally control, without a lease, without any written agreement, and without any protection when things changed. And I wasn't angry in that moment, the way people expect. I wasn't yelling or hitting the steering wheel. I was just clear about the fact that the system I thought I was part of had only worked because I kept it working, and the second I wasn't inside it, it didn't hold up at all. And I looked back at the transactions again, this time not as routine, but as records, each one labeled rent, each one dated, each one tied to a specific point in time where I had transferred money under the assumption that it meant something defined, and I realized that I had documented everything without meaning to. Not for protection, but out of habit. And that detail stood out because it was the first thing that felt like it might matter going forward, not emotionally, but practically. And I thought about the conversation I had tried to have the night before about asking for 30 days, about how quickly that had been shut down. And I compared that to what I was looking at now, 36 payments consistent, labeled traceable. And the difference between those two things was hard to ignore, because one was a statement and the other was proof. And I sat there long enough for the initial shock to wear off, completely replaced by something more stable, not calm exactly, but focused like the part of me that handles pressure at work. Had stepped in and taken over the part that doesn't get distracted by how things should have been, and instead looks at what is and what can be done about it. And I opened my notes app and started writing down numbers, dates, anything that felt relevant, not because I had a full plan yet, but because organizing information was something I knew how to do, and it gave me a way to move forward without needing everything figured out. And I glanced at the house one more time, not expecting anything to change, just acknowledging it for what it was now, not a place I lived, but a place I had been paying for. And that distinction mattered more than anything else in that moment, because once I saw it that way, the situation stopped being confusing and started being defined. And defined problems are easier to deal with than unclear ones, and I picked up my phone again this time, not to scroll or check anything, but to think about who I needed to talk to. Not family, not anyone who was already involved, but someone who could look at the situation without the same assumptions I had been operating under. Someone who could tell me what this actually was, in terms that didn't rely on how things were supposed to work between people who share a last name. And I took a breath steady, controlled the same way I do before stepping into a situation at work where I know I need to be precise. And I understood something in a way I hadn't before, that what happened that morning wasn't just about being told to leave. It was about realizing that the last 3 years had been built on an idea that didn't hold up when tested. And once that clicked into place, the next step wasn't about reacting, it was about deciding what to do with that information. Because for the first time since I saw the boxes on the lawn, wasn't trying to process what had happened anymore. I was figuring out what it meant. I drove back to the hospital instead of anywhere else, not because I had a shift, but because it was the only place that still felt structured, and I needed that more than anything in that moment. So I parked in the employee lot, walked through the same entrance I used every night, nodded at security out of habit, and headed straight to the break room on the 3rd floor, where the couch always smelled like burnt coffee and cleaning spray. And I sat down there still in my scrubs, phone in my hand, not scrolling, just holding it like I was deciding what to do next. And that's where Donna found me. About 20 minutes later, already in her day, shift uniform hair, pulled back coffee in one hand, and she took one look at my face and closed the door behind her without asking permission, which was her way of saying this wasn't a casual conversation, and she didn't start with sympathy. Didn't say I'm sorry or that sucks. She just set her coffee down and said talk, so I did not dramatically, not all at once, just the facts, the boxes on the lawn, the new lock, the text message, the 3 years of payments, and she listened without interrupting, arms crossed, leaning against the counter like she was running through something in her head while I spoke. And when I finished, she didn't react emotionally. She asked one question, how did you pay him? And I said Zelle every month. And she nodded once like that confirmed something, then asked, what did you write in the memo? And I said rent every time. And that's when she reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone and said hold on, and dialed a number, without hesitation putting it on speaker, as she leaned back against the counter, and when the call connected, she said, Marco, I've got something for you. And then she looked at me and nodded like, go ahead. So I repeated the situation, same details, same order, and the voice on the other end didn't react the way I expected either. No surprise, no disbelief. Just a pause and then a few direct questions. Do you have a lease? No. How long have you been paying? 3 years. Do you have records? Yes, every transfer labeled rent, and there was another short pause. The kind where someone is fitting pieces together. And then he said, okay, what your father did is likely an illegal lockout. And he said it in a way that made it sound simple, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just a category that the situation fit into. And I sat up a little straighter on the couch because that was the first time anyone had put a name to it. That wasn't personal, wasn't about family, wasn't about feelings, it was just a legal description of an action. And he explained it in plain terms that even without a written lease, if you've been paying regularly and living there, you're considered a tenant at will in most states, which means the person you're paying can't just change the locks and put your things outside without notice. They have to follow a process, usually written notice, usually a set number of days, and I listened carefully, not interrupting, because this was the first time the situation felt like it had structure again, like there were rules I didn't know about but could learn, and he continued saying the fact that I labeled every payment as rent mattered, that it showed intent, consistency, and agreement, even if nothing was signed, and that the text message my father sent could also matter depending on how it was phrased because it showed how he viewed the arrangement. And I glanced down at my phone when he said that, replaying the message in my head, "Your room is Megan's now, come get your stuff, don't make a scene," and I realized that what had felt like a final decision that morning might actually be evidence of how that decision was made, and that shift in perspective was small but important because it moved me from reacting to understanding. And he didn't tell me to sue right away or make any big moves. He just gave me steps: take screenshots of every transaction, keep the messages, don't delete anything, document the timeline while it's fresh. And then he added one more question almost casually: has your father been reporting that income on his taxes? And I paused for a second because I didn't know for sure, but I had a strong feeling about the answer, and he didn't press it, just said, "Keep that in mind. We can talk about it later." And then the call ended as quickly as it started, and the room felt quieter after that, not empty, just different, like something had been clarified that couldn't be undone. And Donna picked up her coffee again, took a sip, and looked at me like she was checking if I had caught everything. And I nodded, because I had not every detail but the important part, that what happened wasn't just unfair, it was potentially actionable. And she didn't say "I told you so" or push me in any direction. She just said, "You've got options now," which was the first time that word had come up all day, options. And I sat there for another minute, not overwhelmed, not frozen, just thinking in a more organized way than before, because now there was a path. Not a full plan yet, but a direction that didn't rely on convincing anyone in my family to see things differently, and that mattered more than I expected. Because it meant I didn't have to argue, didn't have to explain, didn't have to prove my side to people who had already decided what they believed. I could focus on something else entirely, something that didn't change, based on who was louder or more convincing. And I pulled up my banking app again, this time not to calculate, but to start saving. Screenshot after screenshot, each one clear, each one labeled building. Something that felt solid in a way the last 3 years suddenly didn't. And I understood then that whatever came next wasn't going to be about getting even in the way people usually think it was going to be, about using what was already there, the records, the messages, the facts, and letting those speak in a place where they actually mattered. My phone started buzzing before I even finished organizing the screenshots. Not a single call, but a steady stream of messages, one after another, each one carrying the same tone in slightly different words. And the first was from my aunt, Sandra, who doesn't usually reach out unless there's something to comment on. And she wrote, "Your dad says you're making this harder than it needs to be. Honey, Megan's getting married. Just try to be supportive." And I read it once, then again, noticing what wasn't there. No question about what actually happened, no attempt to hear my side, just a conclusion already formed and delivered like advice. And before I could even decide whether to respond, another message came in from Uncle Rick, shorter, more direct. "Gerald told me you're asking him for money. That doesn't sound like you." And I leaned back against the couch, phone still in my hand, watching the pattern form in real time, because this wasn't random. This was coordinated in the simplest way possible. One version of events shared outward, repeated and accepted without challenge, and within the next hour there were 4 more messages from cousins. I barely spoke to all variations of the same idea, that I was being dramatic, that I should just move on. That family comes first, and the wording changed, but the message didn't. And what stood out wasn't what they were saying, it was how confident they were saying it. Like they had all been given the same script and saw no reason to question it. And I scrolled through them slowly, not reacting yet, just taking in the consistency. Because consistency like that doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone sets the narrative early and clearly enough that everyone else fills in the gaps themselves. And I didn't need to guess who had done that. My father had always been good at explaining things in a way that made him look reasonable, not aggressive. Not unfair, just practical, and I could already hear how he probably told it that I wanted independence, that I chose to leave, that I was now causing trouble over something that didn't need to be complicated, and I could see how easily that version would land with people who weren't there because it sounded clean, simple, and most importantly, it didn't require anyone to question him. And that's the part that hit harder than the messages themselves, not the criticism, not the judgment, but the speed at which everyone accepted it without asking me a single question, not one call, not one what happened, just assumptions delivered as conclusions. And I sat there with the phone in my hand, feeling something shift that wasn't loud or emotional, but steady, like a line being drawn without needing to announce it. Because this wasn't just about being misunderstood, it was about being replaced in the story entirely. My role rewritten from someone who had been paying rent and contributing for years to someone who was now difficult, ungrateful, and conveniently absent from the version being shared, and that kind of shift changes how people treat you almost immediately. Because once someone decides who you are in a situation, everything you say after that gets filtered through it. And I tested that without meaning, to typing out a response to my aunt something simple, "That's not what happened," and then stopping before I sent it because I could already see how it would go. I would explain, they would defend, I would clarify, they would minimize, and nothing would actually change except the amount of time I spent trying to correct something they had no real interest in correcting. And I deleted the message instead, set the phone face down on the table, and just sat there for a minute, letting that realization settle in, that I wasn't just dealing with one decision anymore. I was dealing with a version of events that was spreading faster than I could respond to it, and that made the situation bigger than the house, bigger than the money, because now it was about reputation, about how I was being positioned in my own family. And that kind of pressure works in a specific way, not by forcing you directly, but by making it uncomfortable to push back, by making it easier to stay quiet than to argue with multiple people at once. And I could feel that pull, the instinct to smooth things over, to call each person, explain calmly, fix the misunderstanding one conversation at a time, because that's what I had always done. Keep things stable, keep things from escalating. But this time, it didn't feel like a solution. It felt like maintenance of a system that had already decided how it saw me. And I picked up my phone again, not to respond, but to look at the messages one more time, this time without taking them personally, just observing the pattern. And once I did that, it became easier to see what was actually happening, that the narrative wasn't being built in response to me. It had already been built before I said anything, and everything coming in now was just reinforcement of that. And that meant responding emotionally wouldn't fix it, because it wasn't based on emotion to begin with. It was based on a version of events that sounded clean and required no verification. And I leaned back again, exhaled slowly, and let that sink in. Because this was the moment where the situation either turned into a series of arguments or something else entirely. And for the first time that day, I understood that trying to win this through conversation wasn't just unlikely, it was the wrong approach completely, because the stakes had changed. This wasn't just about being treated unfairly, it was about being publicly defined in a way that justified that treatment. And once that happens, you don't fix it by talking louder. You fix it by shifting the ground the conversation is happening on. And I looked at my laptop on the table, the folder of screenshots already started, the messages saved, the timeline forming piece by piece, and I realized that while my father was building a story, I was building something else entirely. Something that didn't rely on who believed what, something that could stand on its own, regardless of how many people had already made up their minds. And that realization didn't make the situation easier, but it made it clearer, and clarity is a different kind of advantage, because once you have it, you stop reacting to what people say and start focusing on what actually matters. And I turned my phone to silent, not out of avoidance, but out of choice, because I didn't need to answer any of that right now, not when I already knew where it was coming from and where it would lead. And for the first time since the messages started, I felt less like I was being pulled in different directions and more like I was standing still, deciding which direction I was actually going to take. I turned my phone face down and opened my laptop instead, not because I had everything figured out, but because I needed to start somewhere that didn't depend on anyone else's opinion, and I created a folder on the desktop and named it Case without overthinking it. Simple, clear, and hard to ignore once. It existed, and then I started pulling everything into it, one file at a time. Every screenshot I had just taken, each Zelle transaction labeled rent lined up in order, dates visible, amounts consistent, and I didn't rush it. I checked each one before saving it, making sure nothing was cut off. Nothing unclear, because if I was going to do this, I wasn't going to do it halfway. And that focus felt different from everything earlier that day. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't reactive, it was controlled. Like the part of me that handles pressure at work had taken over again. The part that doesn't panic when things go wrong, but just moves through the steps. And I added the text messages next, my father's message about the room, my mother's message, saying it was better this way. And I paused for a second before saving them, not because I hesitated, but because I recognized what they were. Now, not just words, not just something to feel about, but something that documented how this happened, and that shift changed how I looked at everything. Because once you stop treating something as personal and start treating it as evidence, it loses its ability to throw you off balance. And I kept going, opening my banking statements, matching them to the transfers, highlighting the lines that mattered, building a timeline in a separate document, writing down dates, what happened, what was said, not adding commentary, just facts, because facts, I don't need to be explained. They just need to be shown. And as I worked through it, I noticed something I hadn't expected. I wasn't angry. Not in the way people usually are when something like this happens. I wasn't pacing or replaying conversations. I was steady focused, and that steadiness came from a realization that had been building all day, but finally settled into place, that the version of me who kept things smooth, who avoided conflict, who made sure everyone else was comfortable, even when it cost me something, that version wasn't useful here, and more importantly, it wasn't necessary. And I sat back in the chair for a moment, looking at the folder, the files inside it, and I understood that this was the point where things changed. Not because I said anything out loud, not because I confronted anyone, but because I stopped, operating under the same rules I had been following for 3 years. And I said it quietly, just to make it real. I'm not doing that anymore. Not dramatic, not loud, just clear. And once that decision was made, everything else felt more straightforward, because I didn't have to weigh whether something would upset someone or create tension. I just had to decide if it was accurate and necessary, and I went back to the files, organizing them better, renaming them so they were easy to follow, adding a simple index at the top of the timeline, making sure anyone who looked at it could understand it without needing me there to explain. And that detail mattered because I wasn't building this for a conversation. I was building it for a situation where clarity would matter more than tone, and I thought about calling my father again, not to argue, but to give him one more chance to handle it differently, and I did call, sitting there with the phone in my hand, waiting while it rang. And when he picked up, his voice sounded the same as always, controlled, certain, and I told him I needed 30 days. Just 30, not asking for anything beyond what I knew was reasonable, and he shut it down immediately. Said the decision was made, that my sister needed the room, that I should figure it out, and that was it. No discussion, no pause, just final. And I ended the call without pushing further, not because I agreed, but because I had what I needed from it, confirmation not of how he felt, but of how he was choosing to handle this. And I set the phone down, looked back at the laptop, and that was the moment where the last piece clicked into place, because now there was no confusion. No room for interpretation, just a clear line between what had happened and what I was going to do about it. And I went back to work, finishing the timeline, double-checking the files, saving everything to the cloud as a backup, making sure nothing could be lost or questioned later. And the more complete it became, the more the situation shifted in my mind from something that had been done to me to something I was now responding to with intention. And I could feel the difference in how I was sitting, how I was thinking, not tense, not rushed, just deliberate. And I realized that this wasn't about getting back at anyone, not in the way people usually think about it. This was about correcting something that had been handled incorrectly, using the same level of precision I used at work, where details matter and assumptions don't hold up under pressure. And I closed the laptop once everything was saved. Not because I was done, but because the next step didn't require more preparation. It required action, and I sat there for a second, hands resting on the table, looking at nothing in particular, just acknowledging the shift that had happened because earlier that day I had been sitting on a porch trying to understand what was going on. And now I was sitting here with a clear set of facts and a direction that didn't depend on anyone else agreeing with me, and that difference was enough. Not to make the situation easy, but to make it manageable. And I stood up, picked up my keys, and headed for the door. Not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward in a way that felt steady, because for the first time since all of this started, I wasn't reacting anymore, I was deciding. I stood in line at the courthouse with a manila folder in my hands, not gripping it tight, just holding it steady like I would a chart at work. Something I was responsible for but not intimidated by, and the building itself was exactly what you'd expect. Fluorescent lights, worn tile floors, a metal detector at the entrance. Nothing dramatic, nothing that suggested life-changing moments happened inside, which made it easier to focus on what I was there to do, instead of how it looked. And when my turn came at the clerk's window, I laid everything out without over-explaining unlawful eviction, complaint, small claims, filing supporting documents, and the clerk, a woman with reading glasses and a voice that didn't change, no matter what she was handed, flipped through the stack slowly, pausing at the Zelle records, then the printed messages, and she gave a small nod, like she'd seen situations like this before, stamped each form, and said, "You'll get your court date in the mail," and that was it. No drama, just process, and a few days later, I was back in that same building, sitting in a small courtroom that felt more like a meeting room than anything else. A few rows of benches, a desk for the judge, 2 tables facing forward, and I took my seat at one of them, placing the folder in front of me, opening it just enough to have everything ready, not shuffling, not fidgeting, just prepared. And then my father walked in and sat at the opposite table. No lawyer, just him. Looking around like this was something that didn't belong here, like it had been brought into the wrong place. And behind him, I could see my mother and my sister sitting together, not looking at me, and a few rows back, Donna was there, arms crossed, watching quietly. And I noticed all of it without reacting, just taking it in the same way I take in a room before a shift, observing without attaching anything to it. And when the judge walked in, everyone stood, then sat, and she looked at the file in front of her before speaking, her tone calm, direct, the kind that doesn't invite interruption, and she called the case my name, his name, and then she looked at me and said, "Present your case," and I did not fast. Not slow, just clear. I explained the payments, the duration, the lack of notice, and I handed over the documents as I referenced them, each one already organized in the order I needed, and I didn't raise my voice or try to make it emotional, because I didn't need to. The information spoke for itself. 36 payments labeled rent, 3 years of consistent transfers, the message telling me to get my things from the lawn, and when I finished, the judge turned to my father and asked one question: "Did your daughter pay you $1,200 a month?" And he shifted in his chair, looked down for a second, then said she was helping with the house, it wasn't rent. And the judge picked up one of the printed messages and read it out loud: "Rent's due by the 5th. Don't be late again." And she held it there for a second before looking back at him and saying, "You used the word rent." And that was the moment everything narrowed, not in a dramatic way, just in a way where the space for explanation got smaller, and he tried again, saying it was informal, that it was family, that there was no lease, and she nodded slightly, not agreeing, just acknowledging the words, and said the absence of a written lease does not eliminate a tenancy when payment and occupancy are established. And she set the paper down, and I could feel the shift without needing to look around, because the paper down, conversation had moved out of interpretation and into definition. And she asked a few more questions, all short, all specific. How long had I lived there? How were payments made? Was any notice given before the lock was changed? And each answer stayed consistent, supported by what was already in front of her. And when she finished, she didn't take long to decide. She looked down at her notes, then back up and said, "I'm ruling in favor of the petitioner that the defendant had established a month-to-month tenancy through consistent payment and acknowledgement that the tenancy had been terminated without proper notice and that the lockout constituted an unlawful eviction, and she stated the amount clearly: $10,000, the maximum allowed in small claims, plus any applicable penalties under statute. And she said it the same way she had said everything else: steady, without emphasis, like it was simply the outcome that followed the ficketed information presented. And my father stood up too quickly, chair scraping against the floor, saying, "This is family business, not something for court," and the judge didn't raise her voice. Didn't react beyond saying it became court business when you changed the locks. And that was enough, because there was nothing to argue with at that point. The decision wasn't based on how anyone felt about it, it was based on what had been shown. And I closed the folder slowly, not rushing to leave, not looking back for a reaction, because I didn't need one. The outcome was already clear, and as I stood up, I could feel something settle. Not relief exactly, not satisfaction in the usual sense, but a sense that something had been put back into the right place, that the version of events that had been floating around without structure had finally been anchored to something solid. And I walked out of the courtroom the same way I had walked in, steady, focused. Not because the situation was over, but because the first part of it had been handled in a way that didn't depend on anyone agreeing with me, only on what was true. I walked out of the courthouse, got into my car, and let the door close without rushing to start the engine, because the case might have been decided, but I knew that wasn't the end of anything. It was the point where everything else started to move. And it didn't take long for that to prove itself. Because within a week, the first calls came in, not from people checking on me, but from people trying to understand what had just happened to my father, and the tone had shifted, not supportive, not judgmental, just uncertain, like they were trying to figure out how the story they had been told didn't match the outcome they just heard about. And I didn't explain it, I didn't correct anyone, I just kept my answers short and factual, because at that point, the facts were already out there in a way that didn't need me to repeat them. And then about 6 weeks later, Marco called me again, not casually this time, more direct, saying the IRS had opened an audit on my father, and I didn't say anything right away, because I already understood why 36 payments labeled rent over 3 years unreported income. And Marco broke it down, in simple terms: unpaid taxes on that amount, penalties for not reporting it, interest on top of that. And the total wasn't small, it was enough to turn what had been a private decision into a financial problem that couldn't be ignored. And I sat there listening, not reacting emotionally, just taking in the numbers, because they lined up with everything I had already seen. And when the call ended, I didn't feel excited or satisfied in the way people expect when something like that happens. I just felt the situation continuing in the same direction it had been going since the moment I started documenting everything, and word spread quickly after that, not through me, but through the same network that had carried the earlier version of the story, except this time the details were harder to reshape. Because an audit isn't something you can explain away as a misunderstanding, and people started adjusting their distance, not dramatically, just in small ways that added up: fewer calls, shorter conversations, less confidence in the way they spoke about him. And the same neighbors who had watched my belongings sit on the lawn now had a different set of details to talk about. Not rumors, just facts that had become visible. And reputation doesn't collapse all at once. It shifts gradually, as each new piece of information replaces an older assumption. And I could see that happening without needing to be there, because it showed up in the way people reached out to me, more careful, less certain, like they were recalibrating what they thought they knew. And inside the family, it was more direct. My mother called more than once, her voice quieter each time, not asking me to fix anything anymore, just trying to understand what was happening. And my sister's messages changed too. Less accusation, more frustration, not directed at me as much as at the situation itself. Because the wedding that had been planned so quickly now had complications that weren't part of the original picture. And I heard through a cousin that her fiancé had started asking questions about the house, about the timing, about whether it made sense to build a future there with everything that had just come out. And those kinds of questions don't stay contained. They affect plans, decisions, timelines. And the engagement that had been the center of everything was suddenly surrounded by details that made it harder to move forward without addressing them. And none of that required me to say anything, because it wasn't about what I claimed, it was about what had been confirmed. And that's a different kind of pressure, one that doesn't come from confrontation but from reality, catching up to a version of events that can't support it anymore. And my father called once during that time. His tone controlled, but noticeably different. Not as certain, not as final. And he mentioned the audit like it was something unexpected, something that had gone too far. And I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because there was nothing to argue about. At that point, the process was already in motion, and when the call ended, I set the phone down without replaying it, without analyzing it, because I didn't need to. The outcome wasn't going to change, based on how either of us felt about it. And that was the part that brought a kind of quiet satisfaction, not the idea of someone else struggling, but the clarity of seeing a situation unfold, according to what had actually happened, not what had been said about it. And I went back to my routine after that work, sleep small decisions that were fully mine, and every now and then I'd hear another update through someone else, another adjustment, another consequence, each one connected to the same starting point, and it all followed a pattern that made sense. Once you looked at it without emotion, actions create outcomes, documentation supports those outcomes, and once that chain starts, it doesn't depend on approval or agreement, it just continues. And I realized that what people call revenge doesn't always look the way they expect. It doesn't have to be loud or public or immediate. Sometimes it's just letting the situation move forward without stepping in to soften it, without rewriting it, without protecting someone from the results of their own decisions. And that's what this was, not something I pushed, not something I forced, just something I allowed to play out after I made. Sure, everything was clear, and as it did, the version of the story that had been built at the beginning slowly gave way to something more accurate, not because I argued for it, but because it was the only version that could hold up under pressure. I signed my own lease. A few weeks later, a real one this time, with my name printed on every page in terms that didn't depend on anyone's mood or interpretation, and the first thing I noticed when I got the keys wasn't the size of the place or the layout. It was the quiet, not the kind where you're trying not to bother anyone, just quiet that belongs to you. And I walked in, set my bag down, closed the door behind me, and turned the lock without thinking twice about it. Just a simple motion that felt different now because I knew exactly what it meant. And I stood there for a second, in an empty living room with nothing but a couple of boxes and a mattress on the floor, and it still felt more stable than anything I had left behind, because this time the structure wasn't based on assumptions. It was defined clear, and mine and I started building the space slowly, not all at once, just the basics. First, a table, a lamp, things that served a purpose, not things that made it look finished, and every small decision felt straightforward in a way that hadn't been true before because I wasn't weighing how it would affect anyone else. I was just deciding what worked for me, and that shift showed up in more than just the apartment. It showed up in how I thought about my time, my energy, and what I was willing to accept going forward. Because once you step out of a pattern where you've been overextending without realizing it, you start to see it more clearly in other areas too, and I stopped automatically saying yes to things that didn't make sense, not in a confrontational way, just in a way that respected my own limits, and it didn't make my life harder. Although the way I used to think it would, it actually made things simpler. Because I wasn't constantly adjusting to keep everything else balanced, and I still worked the same shifts, still showed up the same way at the hospital, but when I came home it was different. There was no list of unspoken expectations waiting for me. No tasks that had quietly become mine without discussion, just a space that reflected exactly what I put into it, and nothing more, and that clarity made a bigger difference than I expected because it removed the background pressure I had gotten used to ignoring. And without that pressure, everything else felt more manageable, and I stayed in touch with my mother in a limited way. Short conversations, neutral topics, not avoiding her, but not stepping back into anything that would pull me into the same dynamic again. And I didn't try to rebuild anything with my father, not out of anger just because there wasn't anything to rebuild on the same dynamic again. Terms, and I wasn't interested in returning to a version of the relationship that only worked if I kept adjusting, and over time that distance stopped feeling like a loss and started feeling like space to think clearly, to make decisions without second-guessing whether they would create tension. And that kind of space is something you don't realize you're missing until you have it. And when I looked back on everything that happened, I didn't focus on the moment with the boxes or even the court decision. I focused on what changed after that, because that's where the real impact was, not in what I got back financially or legally, but in how I understood my own role in the situation. How long I had been operating under the idea that being a good daughter meant giving without limits, without documentation, without clarity, and that belief had made sense to me at the time because it kept things smooth, but it also kept me in a position where I had no leverage when things shifted. And the biggest lesson I took from all of it wasn't about legal rights, even though those mattered. It was about boundaries, about understanding that helping someone doesn't require you to remove all structure from the arrangement, and that clear terms don't damage relationships. They protect them because they make expectations visible instead of assumed. And I don't regret standing up for myself, not because it led to a specific outcome, but because it aligned my actions with what was actually happening instead of what I hoped was happening. And that alignment is something you can carry into any situation, not just family. And if there's anything I'd say to someone who recognizes parts of this in their own life, it's this: pay attention to patterns, not just moments, because moments can be explained away, but patterns show you how things actually work. And if you're constantly the one adjusting constantly, the one filling gaps constantly, the one making things easier for everyone else, that's not balance, that's a role. And roles don't change unless you decide they do. And deciding doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like opening a laptop, organizing information, and choosing not to argue about things that can be proven. And if you were in my position, sitting there with your options in the front of you, would you have tried to keep the peace, or would you have followed the process and let the outcome speak for itself? Because that choice matters more than people think, not just for what happens next, but for how you see yourself after it's all done.